Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the Poets Talk Politics series that I've been running since last month at the Comparative Literature Institute of the University of Porto. Today, our guest is going to be Christodoulos Makris. I'm going to, introduce him properly in a couple of minutes, but just to say that, go over the objective of this or what we mean to do with this series. Right? What we try to do here is we start with a reading. In this case, Christodoulos is going to read from a recent book of his, and then we're going to try to broaden the discussion and focus on some of the themes and questions and problems that he raises in his book, right? And try to, take the poem as a point of departure for a broader discussion of in this case, we're going to be going over, the influence and impact that social media have had on politics, right? And how, social media leads to, let's say, more division and, escalation of certain tensions and whatnot. So I'm sure we'll cover things like that. Also, conceptual poetry, uncreative writing and whatnot. So those are the things that we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to just introduce everyone on the panel, and then Christodoulos is going to read a little bit from the materials that he prepared for us today. So I'm going to start with Elina Siltanen. She might be familiar to you by now. She's been, she was on the previous episode with Marie Bach. She is a literature researcher and currently teaches at the Department of English, Language and Culture at the University of Eastern Finland. Her current research focuses on contemporary American poetry, more specifically on how emotional relations are constructed in the reading event and how poetry can situate readers in complex positions. More recently, she has published, for example, an article on the connections between conceptualism and confessionalism in the Journal of Modern Literature, and another one on metamodernism and new sincerity in English studies. She has a very interesting book that I highly recommend called Experimentalism as Reciprocal Communication in Contemporary American Poetry, John Ashbery, Lynn Ginian, Ron Silliman, which was published by John Benjamins in 2016. She has a double doctoral degree from the University of Turku, Finland, and Luleå University of Technology from Sweden. So that's Elina. Then we have a very good friend of mine and a colleague from the University of Buffalo. She just graduated 2 weeks ago or so. Daae Jung is, as I said, right, like recent graduate from the State University of New York at Buffalo. She was an active member of the Center for the Study of Psychoanalysis and Culture and was on the editorial committee of Umbra, a journal of the unconscious. Her dissertation was called The Remnant, Agamben and the Problem of Universality in Contemporary American Literature. And then finally, we have Lígia Bernardino, a colleague of mine at the University of Porto and the Comparative Literature Institute. She is a teacher. She did an MA in Cultural and Interartistic Studies at the University of Porto. And her MA thesis was on eco-criticism and Maria Gabriela Lançol. The title was The Becoming of Community, Eco-Critical Reading of Maria Gabriela Lançol's Para Escreve. She did her PhD on romance literature in 2014 and specialized in Portuguese literature. The title of the work was The Threshold of the Human, a study on Jorge de Sena, Maria Gabriela Lançol, and Gonçalo M. Tavares. Then actually last year, she co-edited an anthology on the post-human with Ricardo Gil Soeiro and my colleague and good friend Marinela Freitas. and she's published, many essays. She has published many essays on literature and philosophy. And finally, we have our guest of honor, Mr. Christodoulos Makris. He is a poet and a writer with a practice rooted in contemporary, experimental, cross-disciplinary, hybrid, and collaborative poetics. His work is concerned with language use, modes of communication, multiple shifting identities, and the conflation of the public and the private enabled by digital technologies. He has published 3 books of poetry, Spitting Out the Mother Tongue, which came out in 2011, The Architecture of Chance, 2015, and this book was the poetry book of the year for RT Arena and 3 AM magazine. And This Is No Longer Entertainment, which I guess is the book we're going to be focusing on the most, which came out in 2019. He has also released several pamphlets, artists' books, and other poetry objects, including If We Keep Drawing Cartoons, 2016, and Browsing History, 2018. He is one of Ireland's rising generation poets. He has presented his work widely across media and borders in the process of representing Ireland at Guadalajara. He's presented at a number of festivals and participated in a number of residencies. He's also the poetry editor at Gorse Journal and associated imprint Gorse Editions, and has directed, programmed, and produced numerous projects and events independently or in association with festivals and other institutions. So welcome, Christodoulos. I'm gonna, let Christodoulos now read whatever materials he prepared for us, and then we'll go back and forth. Each one of us will ask a question to Christodoulos, and we'll try to establish a conversation about the poetry that he will read to us today. Welcome.
Thank you so much, João. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I will read from my most recent book, as you alluded to. This Is No Longer Entertainment. It is a book-length poem in 71 sections that documents a period of about 4 years or so in the middle of the last decade through the medium of below-the-line internet commentary. So the entire book is constructed out of fragments of those comments from a range of I guess, platforms or media organizations and so on. So it was the public responses to the articles or the uploads. I'm going to read from across the book, from not consecutive sections. So I guess I'll just get started, and then we can see later on what we talk about. So I will start from number 2. In '87, Huey Lewis and the News released 4, their most accomplished album. I think the undisputed masterpiece is Hip to Be Square, a song so catchy most people probably don't listen to the lyrics. But they should, because it's not just about the pleasures of conformity and the importance of trends. It's also a personal statement about the band itself. Thank you, Patrick. Their early work was a little too new wave for my tastes, but when Sports came out in '83, I think they really came into their own, commercially and artistically. The whole album has a clear, crisp sound and a new sheen of consummate professionalism that really gives the songs a big boost. He's been compared to Elvis Costello, but I think Huey has a far more bitter, cynical sense of humor. That's funny, because the News, minus Lewis, were the backing band on My Aim Is True. As far as I recall, only one of the News played on My Aim Is True. Six. If we keep drawing cartoons, they'll probably give up being terrorists. If we stop drawing cartoons, they'll probably stop killing people. Falling plane, debris, and passengers. Info News, Russell Brand's Revolution Channel, Chomsky debates. 8. I don't believe the writer. Why didn't he stay with many of his fellow countrymen? Looking like a Somali, I would be concerned if I wasn't stopped and questioned. It's happened to a Muslim friend of mine who also travels a lot in his line of work, telecoms. I get calls where a number is displayed, but when I call back, it's disconnected. I suggest getting rid of the beard. Look at the consistency of the people who have blown up planes, trains, buses, and cars. Many blonde Scandi types. I'll take that as sarcasm. Ever heard of Breivik? As a blonde, totally Caucasian, heterosexual female with a fairly British name and a partner of similar ethnicity, I have never, ever been hassled by police. I have strolled through airports in a cloud of weed stink and got a wink from a security guard. They let me take a book of matches onto the plane because they were from a famous nightclub. On any rational calculus, I'm more at risk from bad drivers than terrorists. 29. The artist, the criminal, the stereotypical hard-working Mexican immigrant. They think they have an audience. Kraftwerk, just bleeps mate, a guy pushing enter on his laptop, cut and paste mishmash wrapped in an enormous ego, an ugly personality. It's meaningless, chatter, terrible footage, anti-performance or something like that. All of hip-hop, not music, that. Move away from blatant plagiarism. Picasso was never called an asshole. John Coltrane, just noise. Eat, shit, sleep, repeat, retro, rehash, repeat, revive, revise. My Bloody Valentine, where are the tunes? Black power, symbolism, and salute. There has been no sanction at all. "36. Never trusted them anyway. The founder stole the algorithm from his friend, stole the idea from the Winklevoss twins, connived his associate out of shares. The list goes on, acted like the old class of robber barons and land tyrants of last century, was supposed to represent a new breed of entrepreneur, that of the internet guru or digerati, the smartest of a new generation that had it with the old ways. Pipe dreams. They got lots new pipes around these days to invoke believable dreams. 37. I don't think there's such a thing as an inherently good or bad person. There are only good and bad actions, and most people tend to do both. I guess we hold very simplistic notions of good, folks we agree with, and evil, folks we don't. These simplistic notions enable us to throw around meaningless words like hero or traitor without really considering what it means. I don't think Mr. Snowden's a hero. I don't think he's a villain. Indeed, I don't think about him at all, and I don't understand the fuss. I don't support warrantless surveillance, except in very rare circumstances, and I'm glad this has been brought to light, with a very few exceptions. But I also don't think it's extreme to stop someone at your borders who you believe is carrying sensitive information. The two aren't mutually exclusive. It gets a little murkier in that it's probably wrapped up in some degree of intimidation. It's pretty extreme when, in order to justify detaining him, the authorities explicitly state that journalism that seeks to inform the public about government actions is terrorism if the public might react by asking the government to change its policy. This comment was removed by a moderator because it didn't abide by our community standards. Replies may also be deleted. 42. A beaten wife divorcing her abusive husband and getting a non-molestation order wasn't in the citizenship pamphlet. Some sanity amongst all the Twitter SJWs who are the movers and shakers. They disagree with lots of disagreeable messages. Immediately above was the room where Germaine Greer started writing The Female Eunuch. Some sort of canvassing of opinion that women and trans women are different in some ways. They call themselves meninists. Such jewel-like language is outside time, he thinks. The brilliant genius on the NY Times, bold, cutting, but always polite, with never a word out of a strong, muscular athlete like Serena Williams. Just saying is dead right. I hadn't heard of Monroe's plea that language is fluid. The meaning of words are defined by how they're understood. It is not a zero-sum game. "45. It's bloody common sense. Salt water is dangerous. People drown in water. That's common sense. Neither Mr. nor Mrs. Kurdi knew you could drown in water. They must have done well not to hear about all the people drowning in the Mediterranean. They took a shortcut that went horribly wrong. The dad had a life jacket, so obviously knew it was dangerous. He had a Facebook page, which showed a comfortable but not luxurious life. He took a gamble and it failed. They were fleeing Turkey where there wasn't a war. That is not a reason for asylum, that is economic migration. Another poor judgment on his parents' part. Maybe they should apply for visas, just like many other immigrants. Were they planning on crossing the Atlantic? Seriously? They would probably end up begging in the street. Is the USA morally obliged to let me in? Darned autocorrect. Hubris and karma come to mind. There's quite a lot of it. The danger is people fleeing war can't judge the decisions. Moral preaching. The safety of your cozy home. The stupidity. Sick of it. "53. Shock in art works best when it's incidental because the casually racist murders in Sex and Death in Sigatoka is shocking until you realize. The way we treat animals will also come as a shock one day when humans are incredibly good at fooling themselves, which art that does not conform to acceptable maximize profit from appealing to the widest. Censorship has become a financial. Would American Psycho forget Islam? The true threat to Western liberal society is pictures had made Fight Club. Somehow it still even shocks, but shock will naturally continue apes. Unlike now. Some commentators, a lot of people realized them is conformity. Will kill each other for? Domination by big business, instrument and lowest common denominator commercial vectors means shock is inevitable. We're reduced to the animal in the equation. The main character fits all too perfectly Australia's racist history. Apparently, when art sets out to shock and is shocking to people, the status quo itself is shocking. 58. No, 56. 56. Freedom of speech isn't all it is cracked up to be. Customers started to use Facebook for other things. It was quite a surprise, the Arab Spring. A user posts a cartoon of Mohammed the Prophet in France. Is it true that many Americans think Je suis is French for Jesus? He did not invent social media. He did not invent the self-publishing upload page. Someone else did. He just nicked the idea. A Muslim family posts pictures of their son tortured by US soldiers. I wish my daughter would find a lovely man like that. If the whole of humanity follow the 10 commandments with love, whatever their religion. 58. A bit aimless and low budget, a bit unserious. Fantastically quick at thinking on his feet. Effortlessly bats away over-earnest questioning. In his own bizarre way, a supplicant. Can be as incoherent as hell and still make sense. All froth and manages to sidestep questions like a seasoned ballet dancer. That's an impressive ratio of wrong to words. Obviously, all the bigotry and racism is bad in that. Just one ginormous satire, similar to that of Marine Le Pen, that is proving so successful in France, so too elsewhere in Europe. This is no longer entertainment. They've chickened out of the deserved cowboy climax by banning guns, open warehouses, and give free tacos, bags of cement, house paint to the needy. 62. There's a wider conversation, though, about the extent to which society values its artists. As it has always been, that people who are getting rich are not Black musicians. If Prince had been born 30 years earlier, he would have been a bebopper. This is the Beatles, becoming essentially a studio band after 1966. People need to write the code, design the systems, etc. Why should musicians, authors, etc. earn vast sums of money? All e-commerce innovation happens in the porn industry. Why should anyone get paid if cavemen didn't? Why pay the plumber at all? Does Prince get paid if I flush the toilet? This comment is very lightweight. Even though I like panpipes and also glockenspiels, I didn't have the patience to carefully read it. I used to think that talent was the magic formula, and either you had it or you didn't. In about 91, a dude at uni showed me his computer, which was connected to computers all over the world. Blue screen with white text on it. He was breathless with excitement. I shrugged, failed to see the point or possibility, and went for lunch. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christodoulos. Thank you very much for that. Very, very interesting and very funny. We'll talk about how funny your book is. I'm sure. I'm gonna ask Lígia to go first and ask the kickoff question.
Okay. As I was reading your book, I found it that it wavered from trivialities to serious matters. Sometimes it was poignant, sometimes it was ludicrous, sometimes really unsettling, I suppose. And it made me think about how comfortable should we feel about the future. And I was thinking of some of the words you've selected and you've put in your book. For example, there are voices in your book that say there is no possibility of redemption, in poem 3, for example. Other voices that comment on refugees and the deaths on the Mediterranean. It really impressed me, this sentence, for example, it's bloody common sense, salt water is dangerous. You read it right now about Kudi, the little boy who died. And then, if this is a portrait of the present society, are we actually in the brink of something powerful and dangerous? On the other hand, some of these comments, must we take them seriously or just laugh at it? For example, are they just an escape from the world? For example, in section 3, page 13, say, I started around 6 p.m. and finished around 5 a.m., stayed up, went to breakfast, then went to bed. And it's like a cycle. It goes on and on and on. And then there are those striking words, like I said before, about the little Kurdi boy that died. And how do you, what's your opinion? Do you think that these sections and these sometimes really strong and violent comments are an excuse for some deceptive lives, some difficult lives, some lives that seem to have no purpose? Can you talk about something like that? Is this a sign of the present society, or are these sections or are these comments just a way of avoiding the present society and escaping the reality? Maybe.
Yeah, it goes to the central question on whether digital lives or lives online are any less real than what we call real life, because and as the pandemic is showing, since I made this book, digital lives are real, is a real life. You know, we exist digitally more than we exist almost in corporeal, in physical forms. You know, we have gathered here from all over the world, but we haven't gathered here all over the world. We exist through this screen. So this was already happening, and this is it goes down to the central kind of investigation of what I was trying to do with this book, as to whether these voices that comment, are they a manifestation of another reality? Are they, as you say, an escape or something performatively hyperbolic? But even if that is the case, then it does exist and it does affect the reader being all of us, including the person who has made the comment. Even if the person who has made a comment isn't even a person, we might be talking about bots here as well, but then there's a person or there's a system behind that too. So what the portrait of the time might be is all of these things and all of these questions, which are, I think they're still unresolved. I don't think that they'll be resolved any time soon. But this something that's being created, and there's this circular this feedback loop of the digital commentary, of what we as individuals standing outside of that commentary go in and read, and when we become aware of all these things, and we're subjected to sometimes kind of violent commentary, you know, whether it's visual, whether it's textual, and how does that then enter our everyday lives? So how does that enter our opinion stream? Who do we communicate with? Has it and we hear this a lot, we have heard this a lot for a long time. Does it create these echo chambers where all we hear is all we want to hear? So does that separate people into different extremes and so on? So these are some of the questions I was finding myself investigating or interrogating by doing this book. And while I was doing it, I didn't even know what I was doing, to be honest. I did, you know, I think a lot of poets will say that as well, while they are writing something that they're not aware of what they're doing. There's something a little bit more intuitive going on, and then kind of years later you might kind of figure out what you were doing that particular project for. So it started for me as an exercise in. I got very interested and kind of almost obsessed by reading the comments, by reading especially articles in newspapers, online versions of newspapers that had torrents of comments, like so many of them, and also often going off tangents to completely different things. So a lot of these sections, for example, each just to be clear, each section in the book corresponds to commentary on a single either article in a newspaper or an upload on YouTube or something. So so sometimes when you see within the same section in the book, within the same, let's call it small poem, something going off tangent, it's not me introducing a different subject, is the actual conversation in the comment section kind of veering off to something else. And sometimes that's completely for no reason. Other times it kind of leads there. So I find myself very intrigued about following this kind of below the line, let's call it the bottom half of the internet, and without realizing, I started copying and pasting comments because I find them either hilarious or ridiculous or extreme, or sometimes really sublime, sometimes kind of wonderful poetic language, poetic sentences. So and I thought at start, I thought, oh, maybe I'll make a triptych or something. I make a little poem with this process. And before I knew it, I had kind of several dozen pages of stuff, and that led me to kind of continue it until it felt exhausted. And I don't know whether it coincided, but it kind of I felt like I was concluding what I was doing, and I wasn't finding much that I could go further. A few months after Trump's election, a few months after Brexit, and these political kind of threads are woven through the book as well.
Thank you. Daae, do you want to go now?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your wonderful reading, and I really enjoy reading your book. And as João briefly mentioned, I also find the book very funny and entertaining, despite the title. This is no longer. I mean, there are a lot of moments that are disturbing, but also it was quite funny. So I want to just ask about that. How do you see the role of humor maybe playing in your poetry book, but also in general, sort of on online culture? And especially I was thinking about, for instance, jokes, because there are a lot of comments that make fun of something serious, right? As the death of refugee on the sea, and salt water is not dangerous, as you read the passage. So I was thinking, because jokes allow us to say what cannot be said sometimes, or what is forbidden to say. And especially now with the so-called the cultural left or the liberal left increases the number of, in a way, how can I say, like social and cultural rules that regulate what we can say and what we cannot say. For instance, like political correctness, obviously, is one kind of big discourse now. And I'm just wondering how you see these things sort of operating in the online platform or social media, something like that. So that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I mean, I kind of read a lot about what comedians say about their the restrictions they seem to be, you know, they feel like they face in their practice, and where, you know, some years earlier, perhaps comedians' job was to go over the line and push the line, but in our current moment, at times, and rightly so, on some occasions, it's you know, it's not acceptable. But humor is a different thing. I think sometimes people or commenters, in this case, is anonymous, faceless individuals making a joke on the death of a refugee child, isn't innocent. So, and what I think we have to always remember is what is the intention. We have, you know, we have the surface of the text that we're reading, or even the meme or something, and then we also always have to be aware of a context. Often I see kind of fellow commenters kind of commenting on other people's I guess posts by saying, oh, I looked at the history of your comments and it suggests this. So we are able to actually do a search on even faceless individuals and see, okay, what is the context behind this particular comment? So then we kind of figure out, okay, this joke is trying to make fun of something serious, or is this trying to alleviate something, or take it somewhere else? So yeah, I think that's also I guess unresolved. I mean, the internet is a place where lots of kind of light things are happening, as well as the very, very heavy things. So there is constantly this kind of switch. It's almost like kind of flipping to another tab and saying, okay, this is the serious bit, this is the funny bit. So it's almost like a release valve. I mean, that can happen too. But while you were starting to ask your question, I was kind of starting having some thoughts about humor, or about kind of lightness in writing, and in poetry in particular. And this is something that, you know, perhaps you can also tell me as well what you feel about this, because there is some you know, the idea that poetry can be funny, or can be light, or can be humorous, or can use these devices, can sometimes come across, you know, or can be criticized, as in not taking certain things seriously. But in the way that I've tried to use these instances in this book, was to actually mirror the kind of tone that comes across in these poems, in these comments, in this space on the internet. So it wasn't a self-conscious device to actually have some funny bits in there and then go to the serious. It was a mirror of what I was finding. And the process itself was quite intuitive. So each of these sections was done and completed very, very quickly, like within, say, 20 minutes, half an hour, because I wanted to keep the rawness of it, and I also wanted to keep my perception of what I was reading as intact as possible. Because then if you go back and start editing what you've done, you almost kind of lose the immediacy of what you have read that morning, and what made you select those particular kind of fragments and kind of put them together in a particular way. So all the editing I've done to the book, because, you know, over the 4 years, I kind of collected material and made at least twice the amount of what went in the book eventually. But the editing that I did was in a macro scale at the end, where I said, well, you know, certain pieces, certain sections might just be, I guess, repeating or something else, or something like that. So that was the editing that I did, but I didn't go into editing individual lines. Does that go to, yeah?
Thank you, Christodoulos. Elina, do you want to go now? I'll have something to say. Let me just say that I will try to go back to what you were saying, Christodoulos, about how you were just trying to mirror what was going on, because you described the project as a documentary, right? I remember that you frame it as such. So I will try to go back to that. Let me just have Elina now ask you one of her questions.
All right, yeah. So one of the things that this book evokes for me early on, and which also came across in the text that you read, is immigration, particularly to Europe, and how that's been, of course, something that has been discussed very much on the internet, the rise of nationalist discourse, people saying all kinds of things about immigrants on the internet. And first of all, I was wondering, is this something that was planned, or did it sort of just emerge from the material? And also I'm thinking about how it's very much a book that is about crossing borders in many ways. So do you think that we could even say that, since it is a kind of an experimental book, so is that also something, the idea of border crossing, is that reflected in the way you write this kind of poetry with an experimental approach? Is there something about crossing borders in literature too? So I guess I'd like to hear what you feel the possibilities of experimental poetry are for negotiating borders and movement across them.
Thanks, Elina. That's a really interesting question. I'll start with the second. Actually, the second bit might be very long. We can go on for a long time, because I feel that, and I've felt that for quite a long time in poetry, in particular, there is a tendency sometimes to rely too much on the form as we find it, and we take certain traditions and we perpetuate them, we add to them, but often we just kind of stay within certain traditions, within certain forms that have been done before. The idea of border crossing, of the porousness of the border in the sense of how we understand poetry and poetry writing, and the process of how, just stepping out and stepping back in, and taking a viewpoint that isn't what we are given. So therefore, being open to stand somewhere else and regard a different space from a different perspective is something that I find occurs more readily in writers who have crossed physical borders in more than one occasion, even as well. So that readiness to write experimentally, that kind of the spirit of wonder, or spirit of kind of investigation and so on, to kind of go to places where we're not meant to go, is perhaps subconsciously cultivated if you have made a certain physical journey as well. I find it correlates. It doesn't always, because sometimes you can take yourself into a new space, and then you, as a writer, as a poet, as an artist, adopt what you find and try and get yourself accepted by the dominant style, or by the dominant way of doing things. But I do find it more and more, and I do kind of question it more and more. And it's something that interests me in terms of research, in terms of finding out more about this, working, cross-linguistically or cross-culturally, or kind of cross-identity and so on. It's a very interesting question, and there's no answer to it. It would actually be interesting to hear what you think as well about that. But then moving on to the first part of your question about migration, immigration, whether it was self-consciously selected. It was a big topic of discussion at the time, during that period, and it was in the news, and it was also in the discourse around the Brexit vote, which was happening around that time, that more or less that I was making this book. So it was there. I didn't go looking for it. It's something that I'm interested in. I'm a multiple migrant too, but that it's got the fact that I used that material has got nothing to do with that. I'm many other things, but I didn't use that material. It was there. It was a portrait of what was happening, and it is quite interesting that there was a time, maybe a little bit after the period that I'm covering, maybe around 2018-19, where that discourse wasn't happening quite as much, but the same kind of transport or migration or attempt to reach Europe and so on was happening. It just wasn't covered quite as much, and that's also something that I'm interested in. Like, why do we speak about certain subjects at certain times, and then we kind of move on to something else, even though those subjects haven't gone away? So yeah, the short answer to the question is that it's there because it was spoken about it, and sometimes the voices kind of speaking in these comments would bring it into the conversation without actually even having there being a need for immigration to be brought in, but it was at the forefront of lots of people's minds at the time.
Yes, thank you. That's all very interesting.
Christodoulos, let me pick on what you were saying about actually right now about this issue of immigration and how it relates to your own your own background, because one of the things that's interesting to me about this kind of poetry is that it tends to look very anonymous, and that's sort of the point of it. It tends to look very anonymous, very impersonal. It kind of seems like you even have very little to do with it, right? Because you were in a way just a mediator or just selecting bits and pieces. But at the same time, as you were yourself saying right now, it kind of resonates maybe to some extent with your own experience, right? As a migrant and as an immigrant poet yourself, right? And I know that in other places, like, for example, there's a poem that I saw has or your poem that has the most views. I noticed on UCD, on the UCD repository, is one about like how you were rejected from a collection or an anthology for not being Irish. You weren't included because you're not really, where are you from? You're not really from here, so you shouldn't really be this anthology, which is very interesting. So I guess my question is like, to what extent this very impersonal, anonymous sort of writing is actually autobiographical or personal, or to what extent is it lyrical, right? To what extent is it a means for expression for you, right? And for your own ideas, for your own thoughts on these topics, right? To what extent there is a personal dimension to this sort of project?
Yeah, just the fact that there is an author who's synthesizing out of material that's already out there means that the personality of that author or their history, their experiences are reflected, even if not on the surface. I don't think that there's an argument about that, because and this is often something I kind of discuss with students when I teach, is that language is the material. So that language is that we use as material. If we take it outside of its lyrical or its kind of personal context and use it exactly as it is, then the way we take it and we reconfigure it, then that's when our agency as individuals comes into the making of the poem. So it's true, the material is external, but them being made into poetry are the responsibility of the author, and that responsibility and that kind of allows the author's personality and kind of experiences to come in. The idea of it being therefore touched by the idea of it being lyric, that's something I'm kind of self-debating about. I think lyric poetry is such a huge tradition going back for so long that all kinds of poetry have to do inevitably are inevitably measured against it, or it's always there somewhere, and it's kind of reflects on what we're all doing, whether it's the least lyrical thing. I don't know whether you can classify something like this as a lyrical poem, but sometimes there's a little bit of lyricism in it because the material that has been used is maybe already contains it. Somebody speaks from a very, very personal point of view, even if it's constructed. So it is read with that tradition on the mind of the author. But then we have to start thinking also about what is the making of poetry in early 21st century when we are operating in a digital space where what we read on a daily basis is exactly the same space where we write on the same on a daily basis. So it's not the case where we exist separately. So the reading and the writing are two separate actions. They're actually happening at the same time and on the same space. So understanding of what reading and writing is, and publishing, documentation. I say to students, have you posted anything on Facebook today? You've published something. So then we have this conversation about what is public speaking. How do we assign something as my post? But if I took that post and put it in a book, I could call it a poem. What is the difference? So because of all of this, there has to be, and it's happening, this kind of reconfiguration of what poetry can do or it's doing, whether there is a stable lyric, whether there can be, whether it could ever be, but whether there can be any more, something that we can say, okay, I read this poem and I hear this poem, and this poem is directing its voice at me, and I take it and I consume it that way. Whereas in our everyday life, that's not what you would do. You get something, you get a tweet, and then you reply to it. So you're in this multi-directional conversation. So how is this impacting poetry? How will it impact it kind of going forward? And that's another kind of open-ended question. It's happening, and it is part of kind of my practice and my research in kind of how I'm trying to write all these things. I'm kind of trying to figure out with this kind of experiments with using found material, but also material that is, let's say, inspired by the online sphere.
Thank you, Christodoulos. We're almost running out of time, but I'm gonna try to have everyone ask a second question to Christodoulos. So let's try to both the people asking questions and Christodoulos, let's try to maybe speed up a bit. But I wanted to because I know that Lígia wanted to hear more about the ethical, the like your ethical positioning, I think, in relation to, and the readers like ethical positioning in relation to the materials that are being documented, right? Because again, like going back to this issue of the documentary, there are all of these languages and registers and viewpoints that you're compiling, right? And also the way that you read it, right, is very, I think, very neutral, right? I think you keep it. I don't know if it's intentional or not, right? But in any case, the experience we get as readers, right, is more or less of an ambiguous positioning, right, in regard to what you think about all these things. So I wanted to pass the ball to Lígia, because I know that she had some questions about this, right? Like,
yes, but let me pick on what you said, Christodoulos, about the borders and frontiers and public and private. And I was thinking about some of the words you've selected to your book. For example, one of the sentences I picked was, "The ghost is in the machine." And then, for example, there's another sentence like this: "Why is it strangely magnetic when I'm scrolling down the screen? And then the internet is not a man's space." And that made me wonder about the borders between the medium, which is a machine or something mechanical, and then the humankind and the perception you have of reality. And I was wondering if the medium will change the perception you have of the world, and if that involves some kind of ethical consequence. Let me try to. I was also thinking about some ideas when there was this illusion of the mechanical world and internet and so on, cybernetic world, that maybe you could put consciousness inside the computer and it would, and then mankind would not be the same. What I'm trying to formulate is this: is this cybernetic world turning humankind into something different, and are there ethical consequences about it?
Yeah, well, big question. I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer.
Yes, okay.
What I would say is that we talk about the internet as a machine, and it is a machine, but it's also it's a network. It's a series or you know, a long series of connections, isn't it? So, and it's also, it's real, it's very real. It's not a cloud, it's not something that doesn't exist. You know, we speak in these kind of terms sometimes, that we kind of assume that the internet isn't real, and it doesn't exist anywhere specifically, but it is real. But what it's made of is made of people. It's made of humans, or humans have made it, but it's also made of humans. I know there are algorithms, there is a lot of that goes on, that it's not strictly human, but it is made of humans and humanity. And I think what it reflects back, we often dismiss it as, oh, it's only the internet, it's only internet life. But what it reflects back is uncomfortably close to what happens out there. You know, what we are capable of, or what we think, or what we feel as a, you know, as a whole. So it's not. Basically, what I'm saying is, I don't see it as an alien kind of organism. I see it as an organism that is made out of humans. But yeah, there's so many other considerations there that I wouldn't be kind of qualified or capable of kind of going deep into. But this is what I would feel, you know, this is what I would, you know, I would sometimes be skeptical of people say, well, it's only internet life, it doesn't matter. It does, because it reflects us.
Yes, and language portrays the unconscious as well, isn't it? And when you are with the computer, you just put everything in it, and sometimes it comes right in the instant, and then what is inside of you shows.
Yes, indeed, and then you may be typing something and then you may delete it, but there is a record, there is this ghost, there is this footstep of you having done something as well. It exists somewhere. Now, whether somebody can uncover it, I mean, yeah, if it exists, it can be uncovered. So it is a reflection of what we do. I mean, there are kind of ways to figure out what you're looking at. I'm looking at the at the grid now, but at different times I'm looking at a different face. There are I understand there are kind of ways of somebody reading or knowing who I'm looking at and what I'm looking at. So all these things are becoming a lot more, the capability of them is frightening, but it is at the same time always starts from the human. There's always the human bias in it, and we read a lot about human biases of algorithms and of face recognition software and so on. It's there because it's made by humans, and the human kind of weaknesses are all in there.
Thank you.
I would say, yeah.
Daae, do you wanna go?
Sure. Like, do we have enough time? I can go.
I think so. Christodoulos, can we go for another 15 minutes or so? Is that okay?
Yes,
Sure,
yes.
let's do that.
Okay.
So yeah, just going back to, I think, some of the things you mentioned, Christodoulos, about like how you emphasize how internet culture is not something other than physical reality, but it is a sort of extension of it. And I totally agree in the sense that it's a kind of new public space. It's the public where people really, as you said, the multi voices are heard. But in relation to this question of politics or the new public, I just was thinking about, maybe this is another big question. I don't really have a clear answer, but the relationship between maybe art or the role of art in all these things, because in one of the poems, I think you also read it, like you mentioned shock in art, right? How art and provocation. And especially I was thinking about the tradition of, in the tradition of avant-garde art, art meant to offend, art meant to provoke, transgress, and so on. But at the same time, social media, especially internet space, is also a kind of transgressive. There are a lot of transgressive comments. And just my one question is whether you see the internet or online space as inherently transgressive space, and if so, like how you see the role of art in contemporary times. And I was also having in mind, for instance, someone like Angela Nagel. I'm not sure whether anybody is familiar with her work, but there when she analyzes internet culture in her book, she basically claims that transgression is not inherently leftist or more progressive style, as we used to think in the 60s or during the counterculture. We tend to associate like transgressive acts with progressive, but now the right-wing political camps appropriate transgression. They are transgressive, and as you said, many of these reactionary comments are quite transgressive, I would say, and shocking and provocative. So in this political climate, in the internet culture and outside as well, how should we rethink of the role of art in relation to transgression? Do you want your art or poetry to be provoking, offending, but then how do we prevent art from being reappropriated by this right-wing, transgressive energy or something like that? So that's kind of.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's something that it kind of got me back to thinking too about Naomi Klein's No Logo, where she speaks a lot about the the advertising industry always going back and appropriating kind of, let's call it transgressive art, or art that kind of that kind of breaks through boundaries, and then it always gets appropriated towards commerce, towards the capitalist forces make it work for itself. So it's an ongoing issue, and as you rightly say, the transgressive, the shocking part of society, it comes from the right now, and also right and left have seemed to me like they have broken up. There's certain things that you view and you follow, and you kind of think, I get this, I know where this is come from, I know where this is background, but then something happens and you kind of realize it's very, very close. The extremes are very close. It's almost like it's a loop. So if you go far enough to the left, then you start finding yourself far to the right. In some ways. So it's not a line as we used to understand it, I think, and that adds to the difficulty in what the artist is doing. If the artist is working arts, the artist is always working politically, whether they like to or not. But if somebody is working self-consciously politically, how do they position themselves, especially in the current climates? And I'm not sure what the answer is. I think the answer is in the intuition and intuitiveness. I think there is. Everybody has their own morality. Everybody has their own kind of way of thinking about the world, but then how do you negotiate what's happening around you? I feel that art always has to look outwards, or it has to look outwards because it's a social practice. But how exactly, it's very difficult to pinpoint because things move on as well. And especially in the, I go back to this idea of the internet kind of fragmenting identities as well, and fragmenting all our relationship with other things, other people, other things, other parts of the world, and so on and so forth. It is, and I think it's still evolving. I think we still are not in a way to say, this thing has settled down, and maybe now we can theorize it. I think it's very, very difficult to theorize it. I know people are doing some really excellent work and excellent attempts to theorize it, like Angela Nagel that you talked about there, and others. But I think it's a living, breathing thing. It's changing currently, and it will be changing for some time, I suspect. So I find that it's almost a process of trying to keep up with everything. And like somebody of my generation who grew up in an analog world, and then digital culture arrived when I was already an adult, is in a position to appreciate or to see certain things a bit more clearly. But then as time goes on, I think we are going to start dying out. So what will happen is that the digital natives, let's call them, everybody will be digital native. So therefore, a kind of more stability will be reached, maturity in this. So therefore, I think still at the moment we're not in a position to say, this is what this thing is. This is how we have to approach it. And anyway, the most interesting art, I think, doesn't have this certainty. I think it's exploratory, and if you start with with a set position. This is how I'm going to approach this. This is my opinion on this. Then you likely end up doing something a little bit more formulaic than you would want to.
Thank you. Thank you.
Elina?
Yes, so something that I found interesting is that despite all the negative things that happen in this book and all the negative and divisive things that are said, the book kind of seems to end on a positive note. If I look at the last poem and the very last page, and if I quote from there, it says, "We're urged to be divided along sectarian lines, to try to erode the idea of community or fraternization. The only thing that has ever mattered is love." And of course, I'm now taking that out of context. It goes on from there. That's not really the end of the poem, but it's interesting that it's surprisingly powerful that it comes up here on the last page. So do you maybe want to talk more about that? Do we have a hope, or should we have hope for community, perhaps?
I went a bit soft at the end, right? And I went a bit. I brought love. No, it's a joke. But yes, hope. Yes, I think there's hope throughout the book, despite a lot of the difficult material, a lot of the sometimes unpalatable material. You know, it's not all that. I think throughout the book there is the lightness. You know, there is a lot of the points of view kind of shift, and there is a lot of positive in there as well. I know that often we tend to focus on the kind of more kind of negative as something shocking. But yeah, it was kind of deliberate that I ended it with that particular piece. It came towards the end of the process as well, so it was kind of there. It kind of sort of fitted to be there. But it's kind of going back to what we said before. You know, we are kind of humans, and what we kind of create on the online space is created by us. So kind of we have the power. I mean, we are what makes this work. And you know, we have seen it briefly over the past year and a half. I think that kind of things we can work towards kind of positive developments. It's been briefly, and it hasn't necessarily kind of continued that way, because you know there's all kinds of conflict going on, you know, while we're trying to figure out what to do with the pandemic. But the possibility is there, the capability is there, the potential is certainly there, and it's in the language. So if it's in the language, it's in us. So it's possible for sure.
Yes, that's a great answer, I think.
Thank you, Christodoulos. I just wanted to ask a final question. I think it more or less overlaps with this one. So let's hope you'll have something else to say about it. I just wanted to hear a bit more about that issue that I raised before about, you know, at the ethical positioning of both you who are collecting, gathering these materials, and the reader. Like, what is the reader? So, but I guess this is what I want to know. What do you want the reader to take out of the book? Like, what do you expect someone that goes through, you know, this sort of like shopping mall, you know, assemblage of quotes, right? That you have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and, you know, mashed together. And here I'm thinking about a poem that I really liked. I even talked about it with you back in the golden age of 2019 when we met in Ireland. But I really like Robert Fitterman's "This Window Makes Me Feel," and I do think it really has a lot in common with your own poem. And there, I remember that you know, some critics described Fitterman's approach there as non-therapeutic, in the sense that, you know, he's he's again like kind of like you, right? Documenting, compiling, but it doesn't really give you an answer, right? Like it doesn't really tell you how you're supposed to feel about all of this, what you're supposed to take from it. Like what is the point of basically, like if I'm not a, if I wasn't a poetry scholar, if I was just reading your book in different contexts, what would you want me to take from your book and all of these different languages and registers and whatnot?
Yeah, there is no answer to that. I don't have a particular. It's part of the project. The fact that there is nobody there telling you what to take away from this is part of what this project is about, and also my poetry in general is. There's an attempt. I'm conscious about not or avoid injecting into it this kind of moral position or an explicitly moral position. I think each reader that comes to it, whether a reader is a poetry scholar or whether the reader is somebody who's never read poetry before in their life, although certainly not this kind of poetry, or anybody, is hopefully is going to find some kind of gap in the material where they can insert themselves and they can position themselves in the material with a viewpoint or a standpoint, to say, oh yes, this is what I think about this, oh this is what I think about that. It's kind of, this is where I view the ideal reader, is that there isn't one, and the reader will come in and they will find a gap, and they will find a space to say, I recognize this, I can read these words make sense, they are words that I recognize, their positions are recognized, where do I stand in all of this, what do I take out of this? And then they will ask themselves, why is this poetry? And then I won't give them an answer. There is no answer in the book, there's no answer in the work. They have to figure it out themselves, because I like to give the reader kind of I expect the reader to kind of bring their own way of thinking and their own personality, interests, mindset into this, and ask questions and kind of be curious. And then they can say, no, this doesn't work for me. That's okay.
Thank you very much, Christodoulos. And so maybe let's stop here. And so I'd like to again thank all of you, and especially of course you, Christodoulos, for being here. And I'll just say that the video, I'm going to send the video to you for edits and whatnot, but it's going to be, we should let people know that it's going to be available for whoever didn't see the whole thing, wasn't able to make it. It's going to be on the YouTube channel of the Comparative Literature Institute. So and it hopefully in very good company. You're already there with Marie Buck, who I really like, and I think all the other people here had a good time reading and engaging with her work. And here I think I can speak for all of my colleagues and friends that it was a real pleasure to talk to you and read your project. So thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. Your questions were great, and yeah, it was great to have the opportunity to talk about all these things, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys, and I'll see you on the next episode.